Marcus Johnson checked his watch for the fifth time as he sat on the hard wooden bench outside courtroom 12. His traffic court hearing was scheduled for 9:30 a.m., but it was already past 10, and the courthouse hallway remained packed with anxious faces. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, adding to his growing headache. Docket number 47,829, Johnson, a court officer finally called, not bothering to look up from his clipboard. Marcus straightened his navy tie and buttoned his jacket. At 34, he had built a successful career as a software developer at one of the city's fastest-growing tech firms. He had never been in trouble with the law. This traffic ticket for allegedly running a red light was his first court appearance of any kind. "You got this?" whispered Darius, his roommate who had come for moral support. "Remember what your cousin said. Just state the facts." Marcus nodded, grateful for the encouragement. His cousin, Detective James Wilson, had given him tips on how to present his case. The light had malfunctioned that day, showing green and red simultaneously. Marcus had dashcam footage to prove it. As he pushed through the heavy wooden doors into courtroom 12, the temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Judge Patricia Harmon sat elevated behind her massive oak bench, her thin lips pressed into a permanent frown beneath sharp, calculating eyes. At 63, she had presided over this district for 15 years, developing a reputation for harsh sentences and an even harsher demeanor. "Approach," she commanded without looking up from her papers. Marcus walked forward, standing at the defendant's table. The courtroom was nearly empty except for a few clerks, the next defendants waiting their turn, and Darius sitting in the back row. "Mr. Johnson," Judge Harmon finally said, looking up and narrowing her eyes. "Another traffic violation. Your people never seem to learn the rules of the road, do you?" Marcus blinked, caught off guard by the comment. "Excuse me, Your Honor. This is actually my first ticket ever." "Don't speak until I ask you a question," she snapped, shuffling through his file with obvious disdain. "I see you're claiming the light malfunctioned. How convenient." "I have video evidence, Your Honor," Marcus replied calmly, reaching for his phone. "No devices in my courtroom," Judge Harmon barked, "and I didn't give you permission to speak." Marcus noticed several people exchange uncomfortable glances. The court clerk looked down, suddenly very interested in her paperwork. "Now," the judge continued, "how do you plead to the charge of running a red light on March 2nd at the intersection of Oakwood and Pine?" "Not guilty, Your Honor. As I mentioned, I have evidence that." "Evidence?" Judge Harmon interrupted with a dismissive wave. "Let me guess, some fuzzy video you probably doctored on one of those computer programs? I know how you tech types operate." Marcus felt heat rising in his neck, but kept his voice level. "The footage is clear, Your Honor. The light showed both red and green simultaneously due to a malfunction. I stopped, assessed the situation, and proceeded when it was safe." The judge's eyes narrowed further. "People from your neighborhood always have excuses, don't they?" A small gasp came from somewhere in the back of the courtroom. Marcus stood straighter, dignity intact despite the judge's increasingly obvious prejudice. As she shuffled some papers on her bench, he noticed something unusual, a small black device partially hidden behind her gavel stand. It looked like a recording device, which seemed odd given her strict no-devices policy. "Your Honor," Marcus began again, "I believe if you reviewed the evidence." "Enough." Judge Harmon slammed her gavel. "I find you guilty. Fine of $500 plus court fees. Next case." As Marcus turned to leave, still processing what had just happened, he couldn't take his eyes off that strange device on her bench. Something wasn't right, and he wasn't going to let this injustice stand. Marcus walked out of the courtroom with his jaw clenched. Darius quickly caught up to him in the hallway, concern etched across his face. "What happened in there?" I could hear her tone from the back row. Darius whispered. Marcus shook his head, trying to process the unfair treatment he'd just experienced. "She didn't even look at my evidence. Called me guilty without hearing me out." He loosened his tie, feeling like it was choking him, and those comments about my people and my neighborhood, that was straight up racist. They found a quiet corner near the water fountain where Marcus took a moment to collect himself. He pulled out his phone and checked the time, 10:47 a.m. The fine would hurt his budget, but the injustice stung far worse. "I should call James," Marcus said, referring to his cousin, the detective. Something weird was happening in there. As Marcus described the judge's behavior to Darius, a middle-aged woman in a gray pantsuit approached them. She had been in the courtroom during his hearing. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "I'm Helen Myers, court reporter for Courtroom 14. I was waiting for my session and saw what happened. That was completely inappropriate. Judge Harmon has been getting worse lately." Marcus looked up, surprised. "You've seen this before?" Helen glanced around nervously. "Many times. Last week, she gave a white businessman with 3 previous DUIs just a warning, then gave a Hispanic kid the maximum fine for a broken taillight." "Has anyone reported her?" Darius asked. "People try, but nothing sticks. She's friends with the chief judge." Helen hesitated. "But that recording device you noticed, that's new and definitely against court rules. Judges can't record proceedings separately from the official court record." Marcus thought about this new information. Is there someone who should know about this? "The Judicial Ethics Committee, but they move slowly," Helen replied. "Listen, I need to get to my courtroom, but..." She handed Marcus her business card. "If you decide to do something about this, I'll back you up." As Helen walked away, Marcus's phone buzzed. His cousin James was calling him back. "Hey, how did court go?" James asked. "Terribly," Marcus replied, proceeding to explain everything that had happened, including the strange recording device and Helen's comments. There was a pause on the line. When James spoke again, his voice was serious. "That device is interesting. Unauthorized recording in a courtroom is illegal, and if she's using it selectively..." He paused. "Where are you now?" "Still at the courthouse near the east entrance." "Stay there. I'm 5 minutes away. Don't go anywhere." Marcus and Darius waited, watching people stream in and out of the building. Court officers nodded to attorneys, families huddled together before hearings, and clerks rushed by with stacks of files. "What do you think James is going to do?" Darius asked. "I don't know," Marcus replied. "But if anyone can figure out what's going on with Judge Harmon, it's him." A few minutes later, Detective James Wilson walked through the door in his crisp police uniform. At 38, James had already made detective after just 7 years on the force, known for his sharp mind and strong ethical code. "Show me exactly where you saw this device," James said after greeting them. Marcus described it in detail. Black, about the size of a deck of cards, partially hidden behind the gavel stand. It had a small red light blinking. James nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds like a personal recording device. Judges rely on court reporters and official equipment. Having her own secret recorder suggests she's documenting things off the record." "But why?" Darius asked. "Good question," James replied. "Could be evidence tampering, blackmail material, or something else entirely. Whatever it is, it's not legal." He checked his watch. "Is she still in session?" "She had at least 10 more cases after mine," Marcus said. "Give me a minute," James said, stepping away to make a phone call. Marcus and Darius watched as his expression grew more serious with each passing second. When James returned, his eyes had a determined look. "I just spoke with my lieutenant and a judge from the district court. Based on your statement and other complaints filed recently, we have grounds to investigate." He looked directly at Marcus. "I'm going to need you to write down exactly what happened today. Every detail." Marcus nodded, realizing that his traffic court disaster was about to become something much bigger. Marcus sat in a small conference room at the courthouse, carefully writing his statement while Detective James Wilson made a series of urgent phone calls in the hallway outside. Darius paced back and forth, occasionally peeking through the window blinds. "How long do you think this will take?" Darius asked, checking his watch. "I can call in sick to work if needed." Marcus looked up from his detailed account of Judge Harmon's behavior. "You should go. I might be here a while." He offered a small smile. "Thanks for coming with me today. I never expected any of this." As Darius reluctantly left, promising to check in later, James returned with 2 other officers and a woman in a sharp business suit. "Marcus, this is District Attorney Olivia Chen," James said. "She's taking a special interest in this case." Ye Chen shook Marcus's hand firmly. "Mr. Johnson, we've had concerns about Judge Harmon for some time, but nothing concrete enough for action. Your experience today might change that." Marcus handed over his completed statement. "It's all there. The comments she made, The device I saw? Everything. The device is particularly troubling, Chen said, scanning the document. If she's making unauthorized recordings, that violates numerous rules of judicial conduct. James nodded. We've spoken with 3 other defendants from this morning who reported similar treatment, and the court reporter from courtroom 14 corroborated parts of Marcus's account. So what happens now? Marcus asked. James and DA Chen exchanged glances. We're going to execute a search warrant, James explained. Judge Carmichael from the district court signed off on it just minutes ago. This isn't just about racist comments, though those are serious enough. It's about potential corruption of the judicial process. DA Chen added, we believe Judge Harmon is currently on a 15-minute recess. The timing is perfect. Marcus felt a strange mix of anxiety and relief. Will you need me for anything else? Your statement is enough for now, Chen assured him, but we may need your testimony later. James checked his watch. It's 10:54 a.m. Her recess ends at 11 o'clock. We need to move now. As the officers prepared to execute the warrant, Marcus remained in the conference room, his thoughts racing. Just an hour ago, he had been standing before Judge Harmon, powerless as she dismissed him without a fair hearing. Now, the tables had completely turned. At exactly 10:57 a.m., James and the 2 officers, accompanied by DA Chen, walked purposefully toward courtroom 12. A court security officer tried to stop them, explaining the judge was in recess, but DA Chen presented the warrant, and they continued without hesitation. From the conference room window, Marcus could see down the hallway where several court employees had stopped to watch the unusual procession. The officers entered Judge Harmon's chambers through a side door rather than the main courtroom entrance. Marcus couldn't see what happened next, but he could imagine it. 3 minutes later, at exactly 11 o'clock a.m., shouting echoed down the corridor. Court personnel began gathering in the hallway, murmuring in confusion and surprise. At 11:04 a.m., exactly 7 minutes after the officers had entered her chambers, Judge Patricia Harmon emerged, now escorted by James and the 2 officers. Her face was flushed with anger, her normally impeccable appearance slightly disheveled. Most shocking of all were the handcuffs securing her wrists in front of her. This is ridiculous, she protested loudly. Do you know who I am? You can't treat me this way. James remained professional as he guided her forward. Judge Patricia Harmon, you're under arrest for judicial misconduct, unauthorized recording of court proceedings, and violation of civil rights under color of law. People in the hallway stared in disbelief. Some pulled out phones to record the unprecedented scene of a judge being arrested in her own courthouse. Court clerks watched with wide eyes as the woman who had terrorized them for years was led away like any other suspect. Marcus stood frozen by the conference room window, hardly believing what he was witnessing. The judge who had dismissed him so cruelly just moments ago was now experiencing her own form of justice. As their eyes met briefly across the hallway, he saw something he never expected: fear. DA Chen stayed behind, already directing assistants to secure Judge Harmon's chambers and preserve all evidence. She caught Marcus's eye and gave him a small nod of acknowledgement. In just 7 minutes, everything had changed. The courthouse buzzed with activity as word of Judge Harmon's arrest spread like wildfire. Marcus remained in the conference room, still processing the morning's events. A court administrator had asked him to stay available for questions, so he sat there watching the clock tick past noon. His phone hadn't stopped vibrating with text messages from Darius, who had apparently heard the news already. Is it true? Did they really arrest her? Darius's latest message read. Before Marcus could reply, the door opened and Detective James entered, looking tired but satisfied. You wouldn't believe what we found, James said, pulling up a chair across from Marcus. That recording device was just the tip of the iceberg. Marcus leaned forward. What do you mean? The device was connected to a laptop hidden in her private bathroom. She's been selectively recording certain defendants, mostly minorities, and editing the transcripts before they went to the official record. James shook his head in disgust. But that's not even the worst part. He pulled out his notebook and flipped it open. We found a coded spreadsheet. It took one of our tech guys about 10 minutes to crack it. It appears to be a record of payments received in exchange for lenient sentences. Marcus's eyes widened. She was taking bribes? Looks that way. mostly from white-collar defendants with deep pockets. Meanwhile, she was hammering minorities with maximum sentences for minor offenses. James closed his notebook. We're talking serious corruption here, Marcus. The kind that puts judges in prison. A knock at the door interrupted them. Gay Chen entered with Helen Myers, the court reporter who had spoken to Marcus earlier. Mr. Johnson, Chen said, Ms. Myers has provided us with some valuable context about Judge Harmon's history of discriminatory behavior. We'd like to compare notes with your experience. Helen smiled nervously at Marcus. I should have spoken up sooner. I just never thought anyone would believe me against a judge. For the next 45 minutes, they pieced together a disturbing pattern. Helen had been keeping her own private records of Judge Harmon's most egregious behaviors for over 2 years. Different sentences for similar crimes based on race, rude comments made to minority defendants, favorable treatment for certain lawyers who Marcus now knew were likely paying bribes. This case is growing by the minute, Gay Chen said. We've already contacted at least 20 defendants from past cases who may have grounds for appeal based on judicial misconduct. Marcus thought about all the people who had stood where he stood that morning, facing an unfair system with no power to fight back. What happens now? He asked. Judge Harmon is being processed at the county jail, James explained. She's already called her lawyer, some high-priced attorney from downtown. She'll probably be out on bail by this evening, but her judicial career is over. And your case, Chen added, looking at Marcus, has been dismissed, along with all other cases from her courtroom today. Marcus felt a weight lift from his shoulders. I'm glad, but honestly, that doesn't seem important anymore compared to everything else. Helen checked her watch. I need to get back to my courtroom, but I wanted to thank you, Marcus. If you hadn't noticed that recording device, who knows how long this would have continued. After Helen left, James placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. You did good today, cousin. Real good. I didn't really do anything, Marcus replied modestly. I just noticed something weird. Sometimes that's all it takes, Gay Chen said. One person paying attention at the right moment. James's phone buzzed with a message. He checked it and raised his eyebrows. The press is gathering outside. This story is breaking wide open. The courthouse public affairs officer wants to know if you'd be willing to make a statement, Marcus. Marcus hesitated. He hadn't asked for any of this attention. He just wanted fair treatment in traffic court. But he thought about all the people who had faced Judge Harmon before him and all those who might have faced her in the future. What would I even say? He asked. The truth. Chen replied simply. Sometimes that's powerful enough. Marcus took a deep breath, considering the unexpected turn his day had taken and the decision he now faced. Marcus stood nervously in a small room adjacent to the courthouse press area. Through the window, he could see at least a dozen reporters setting up cameras and microphones. This was never how he had imagined his Wednesday would go. You don't have to do this, James reminded him. No one would blame you for walking away now. Marcus straightened his tie and shook his head. I need to do this, for everyone who didn't get a chance to speak up. James nodded with understanding. Just stick to the facts as you experience them. Don't speculate about the investigation. Gay Chen entered the room, looking slightly frazzled but professional. The media attention is growing by the minute. Judge Harmon has been on the bench for 15 years. This is a major scandal. She handed Marcus a bottle of water. Are you ready? Before Marcus could answer, his phone rang. It was his boss, Michael, from the software company. He answered hesitantly. Marcus? Are you okay? Your name is all over the local news sites, Michael said, sounding concerned. I'm fine, Marcus replied. It's been a crazy morning, but I'm okay. Take all the time you need today, and if you need legal support, the company has attorneys who can help. Michael paused. What you did was brave. We got your back. The support brought unexpected emotion to Marcus's throat. Thanks, Michael. That means a lot. After hanging up, Marcus took a deep breath and nodded to Chen. I'm ready. The press conference was brief but powerful. Marcus described his experience in Judge Harmon's courtroom that morning, the dismissive attitude, the racist comments, and his observation of the recording device. He spoke clearly and calmly, never raising his voice or making accusations beyond what he had directly witnessed. I just wanted a fair hearing, he concluded. That's all anyone wants when they enter a courtroom. Questions came rapidly from reporters. Did you suspect Judge Harmon was corrupt before today? How does it feel to have brought down a sitting judge? Have you experienced racism in the legal system before? Marcus handled each question thoughtfully, neither grandstanding nor shrinking from the moment. When asked about his feelings toward Judge Harmon, he simply said, "I hope the justice system works as it should, for everyone involved." As the press conference ended, Marcus noticed a group of people gathering at the back of the room. They weren't reporters. They were ordinary citizens, some of whom he recognized from the courthouse hallways earlier that day. One woman approached him as he stepped away from the microphones. "Thank you," she said quietly. "My son got 3 years from Judge Harmon last month for a first-time offense that usually gets probation." We couldn't understand why she was so harsh. Other stories followed, tales of excessive fines, unfair rulings, and demeaning treatment in Judge Harmon's courtroom. Marcus listened to each person, overwhelmed by the impact one judge had made on so many lives. By mid-afternoon, the courthouse was still buzzing with activity. Investigators continued to search Judge Harmon's chambers and office, uncovering more evidence with each passing hour. James kept Marcus updated on the developments. They found over $200,000 in cash in a locked cabinet behind her law books, James reported, shaking his head in disbelief. And a second set of court records that don't match the official ones. Dae Chen joined them, holding a tablet showing a news website. The headline read, "Judge Aries D.D. Corruption Scandal Rocks County Courthouse." "The chief judge has called an emergency meeting of the Judicial Council," Chen explained. "They're already discussing reviewing all of Harmon's cases from the past 5 years. Marcus sat down, suddenly feeling the emotional weight of the day. "I never expected any of this when I woke up this morning. I just wanted to contest a traffic ticket." James smiled. "Sometimes justice comes from unexpected places. You noticed something others missed or were afraid to mention." Chen nodded in agreement. "The courthouse security footage shows at least 30 lawyers and court employees walking in and out of her courtroom daily. How many saw the same things you did but said nothing?" As the afternoon continued, more people came forward with stories about Judge Harmon. The single event that had started with Marcus's observation was quickly growing into one of the biggest judicial scandals the county had ever seen. By evening, the story of Judge Harmon's arrest had spread beyond local news to national media outlets. Marcus sat in his apartment with Darius, watching his own face appear on the television screen as reporters recounted the day's events. "This is surreal," Marcus muttered, shaking his head as he watched footage of Judge Harmon being escorted from the courthouse. The cameras had caught her angry expression as officers guided her toward a police vehicle. "You're a hero, man," Darius said, grabbing another slice of pizza from the box between them. "People have been dealing with her discrimination for years, and you shut it down in one day." Marcus's phone hadn't stopped buzzing with calls and messages. Childhood friends, former classmates, co-workers, even his mother's church group members were reaching out. Many shared their own stories of unfair treatment in courtrooms and thanked him for speaking up. "I don't feel like a hero," Marcus said quietly. "I just happened to notice something weird." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Marcus opened it to find James standing there in casual clothes rather than his detective uniform. "Thought I'd check how you're holding up," James said, stepping inside. "It's been a crazy day." "I'm okay," Marcus replied, "just trying to process everything." James accepted the offered slice of pizza and sat down with them. "Well, you might want to brace yourself for more. Judge Harmon's bail hearing was an hour ago." "Already?" Darius asked. "That was fast." "High-profile cases move quickly," James explained. "Judge Reynolds from the next county overhandled it. Set bail at $500,000. Marcus whistled. "That's a lot." "And she couldn't pay it," James said with a hint of satisfaction. "Turns out her accounts have been frozen pending investigation. She's spending the night in county jail." The television continued to show coverage of the case. A news anchor was interviewing Helen Myers, the court reporter who had first approached Marcus. "I witnessed Judge Harmon's discriminatory behavior for years," Helen was saying. "Different sentences for the same crimes based on race, dismissive treatment of certain attorneys, special treatment for others. The pattern was clear to anyone paying attention." Why didn't you report it sooner? The anchor asked. Helen looked down briefly. I did, 3 times in fact. Without hard evidence, it was her word against mine. And judges protect their own. James nodded in agreement. She's right about that. The judicial system can be very insular. Marcus's phone rang again, this time a number he didn't recognize. He answered cautiously. Mr. Johnson, this is Anita Washington from the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department. We've been following today's events with great interest. Marcus put the call on speaker so James and Darius could hear. Our office has received multiple complaints about Judge Harmon over the years, but never had sufficient evidence to open a formal investigation, she continued. What happened today changes that. We'd like to speak with you tomorrow, if possible. Of course, Marcus replied, making eye contact with James, who nodded encouragingly. After arranging a meeting time and ending the call, Marcus sat back, overwhelmed. The Justice Department? This is getting bigger by the hour. That's how corruption cases work, James explained. One thread gets pulled, and the whole thing starts to unravel. The local news had moved on to showing footage of people gathered outside the courthouse, many holding hastily made signs reading "Justice at last" and "Equal treatment under law." Look at that, Darius said, pointing to the screen. You started a movement, Marcus. I didn't start anything, Marcus insisted. These feelings were already there. People were already frustrated and angry about unfair treatment. James's phone buzzed with a message. He read it and looked up with wide eyes. The investigation team just found recordings going back 3 years in Judge Harmon's home office, hundreds of hours of court proceedings that she altered in the official record. He shook his head in disbelief. And a list of payments from attorneys, actual evidence of bribes. Marcus stared at the television, watching more people gather outside the courthouse even as night fell. What had begun with this simple observation that morning had unleashed something much bigger, something that had been building beneath the surface for years. What happens tomorrow? He asked quietly. Justice, James replied. Slow, methodical justice. 1 week after Judge Harmon's arrest, Marcus sat in a conference room at the Justice Department's local office. The walls were lined with legal books, and a large American flag stood in the corner. Across from him sat Anita Washington from the Civil Rights Division and 2 other attorneys who had been taking notes throughout their 3-hour meeting. Thank you for your patience, Mr. Johnson, Anita said, closing the folder in front of her. Your testimony has been extremely helpful in building our case. Marcus nodded, his voice slightly hoarse from talking. How many cases are being reviewed now? Over 700, one of the other attorneys answered. Every single case Judge Harmon presided over in the past 5 years. The preliminary analysis shows clear patterns of discrimination. The investigation had grown exponentially since that first day. What had started with a simple recording device had uncovered one of the most extensive judicial corruption cases in the state's history. The numbers are disturbing, Anita had explained, sliding a chart across the table. Black defendants received sentences averaging 40% longer than white defendants for identical crimes. Hispanic defendants faced 35% higher bail amounts. And cases involving certain defense attorneys, the ones we now know were paying bribes, had dismissal rates 4 times higher than average. Marcus studied the chart, feeling a mixture of vindication and sadness. All those lives affected. Which is why the Justice Department is creating a special task force, Anita continued. Every person who received an unjust sentence or ruling will have their case reviewed. Some people will be released from jail immediately. Outside the window, Marcus could see protesters still gathered across the street, holding signs demanding judicial reform. The movement had only grown stronger in the past week. What about Judge Harmon? He asked. Still in custody, Anita replied. The investigation uncovered offshore accounts with over $3 million that can't be accounted for by her judicial salary. She's facing multiple federal charges now: corruption, civil rights violations, obstruction of justice, and tax evasion. Marcus's phone buzzed with a message from Darius. You on the news again? CNN this time. The media attention had been relentless. Marcus had given interviews to local stations, but had declined national appearances, preferring to let the facts of the case speak for themselves. As the meeting wrapped up, Anita walked Marcus to the elevator. "There's something else you should know," she said. "Your actions have inspired others. We've received tips about 2 other judges in neighboring counties with similar patterns of behavior." Marcus raised his eyebrows. "Really?" "This may be just the beginning of a much-needed cleanup of the judicial system," she continued. "People who were afraid to speak up before are finding their courage." Outside the building, Marcus was surprised to find Helen Myers waiting for him. The court reporter looked different somehow, more confident, standing taller. "I thought you might be here," she said. "I just finished giving my statement too." They walked together toward the parking lot, discussing the rapid developments of the past week. "I've been a court reporter for 22 years, Helen said. "I've seen discrimination before, but never so blatant as with Judge Harmon, and I never had the courage to do what you did." "All I did was notice a recording device," Marcus reminded her. Helen shook her head. "You did more than that. You spoke up when it would have been easier to walk away." They reached Marcus's car, and he paused before getting in. "Have you heard about the community meeting tonight at the Civic Center? People who were affected by Judge Harmon are gathering to share their stories." "I'll be there," Helen promised. As Marcus drove home, he passed the courthouse where everything had started just 1 week earlier. The building looked the same, but he knew the system inside was being shaken to its foundations. His phone rang through the car speakers. It was his mother. "Marcus, I'm so proud of you," she said immediately. "Your father would have been too." The mention of his late father brought unexpected emotion. His father had always taught him to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult. "Thanks, Mom," he said softly. "I'm just glad something good is coming from all this." "More than you know," she replied. "Your cousin James called me. He said the chief judge is forming a commission on judicial accountability, and they want community representatives to serve on it." Marcus pulled up to a red light and waited, following the traffic laws to the letter. 1 week ago, he had been just another citizen hoping for fair treatment in court. Now, he was part of something much bigger, a movement for change that was only beginning to grow. 6 months after Judge Harmon's arrest, the community gathered in the renovated main courtroom of the county courthouse. The room had been transformed, not just with fresh paint and new furnishings, but with a symbolic change. The judge's bench had been lowered by 8 inches, a physical reminder that judges were not above those they served. Marcus sat in the front row beside his mother, Darius, and cousin James. He wore a simple navy suit, feeling strange to be back in the building where everything had started. "All rise," called the court officer as Chief Judge Rodriguez entered the courtroom. Unlike her predecessor, Judge Rodriguez walked in without ceremony, smiling warmly at the assembled crowd before taking her seat. At 47, she was the first Latina to serve as chief judge in the county's history, one of many changes that had swept through the judicial system in recent months. "Thank you all for coming today," she began. 6 months ago, our community faced a crisis of trust in its judicial system. Today, we mark the progress we've made together and recognize those who helped bring about necessary change. The courtroom was packed with a diverse crowd. Former defendants whose cases had been overturned, community activists, court employees, and ordinary citizens who had been following the story of judicial reform. Judge Rodriguez continued. "The Judicial Accountability Commission has completed its review of all cases handled by former Judge Harmon. To date, 342 convictions have been overturned due to evidence of discrimination or misconduct. 87 people have been released from incarceration." A murmur of approval spread through the crowd. Additionally, she said, "New procedures are now in place. All courtroom proceedings are recorded with multiple systems. Regular review of sentencing patterns is mandatory. And a diverse community oversight board will help ensure that justice is truly equal for all citizens." Marcus listened intently, still amazed at how far things had come. Judge Harmon herself had pleaded guilty to multiple federal charges and was currently serving a 10-year sentence. 3 other judges in neighboring counties had resigned rather than face similar investigations. "Today, I want to recognize several individuals who made these changes possible," Judge Rodriguez said. Helen Myers, whose detailed records provided crucial evidence. Helen stood from her seat across the aisle, receiving warm applause. Detective James Wilson, whose thorough investigation uncovered the full extent of the corruption. James nodded modestly as people applauded him. And finally, Judge Rodriguez said, looking directly at Marcus Johnson, whose simple act of observation and courage to speak up was the catalyst for all that followed. The applause for Marcus was thunderous. People he had never met stood and turned toward him with appreciation in their eyes. He nodded awkwardly, uncomfortable with the attention but moved by the moment. After the ceremony, people gathered in the courthouse lobby. Marcus found himself surrounded by those wanting to share their stories. "My brother is home now because of you," said one young woman, tears in her eyes. "His sentence was overturned last month. My case was dismissed," an elderly man told him. "I was facing fines I couldn't pay for a violation I didn't commit." Marcus listened to each person, still insisting he had only done what anyone should do when faced with injustice. As the crowd thinned, he found himself standing with Judge Rodriguez near the courthouse steps. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "systems don't change on their own. They change when brave individuals refuse to accept injustice." Marcus looked around at the diverse group of people still mingling in the lobby. "I'm just glad something good came from it all." "More than good," she replied. "Your actions created a ripple effect. 3 neighboring counties have now instituted similar reforms. The state Supreme Court is reviewing judicial appointment procedures. Real change is happening." Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps. Marcus paused before descending, looking back at the building that had once represented unfairness to him and so many others. A small plaque had been installed near the entrance, easily missed unless you were looking for it. Marcus stepped closer to read it. "Justice is not just a word inscribed on our buildings, but an action we must choose every day. May all who enter here be treated with dignity, fairness, and respect." It wasn't a monument to any individual. It didn't mention names or specific events. But Marcus knew, as did everyone in the community, that the words represented a promise for the future and a reminder of how 7 minutes on an ordinary day had changed their justice system forever.